Is This a Great Game or What? Episode 9. Thank you so much for joining us and following and subscribing wherever you listen. We really, really appreciate it. And today, we've got a very special guest. Steve Rushin is going to be our guest today.
Best writer ever.
In fact, my mom, who married to my dad, probably the definition of opposites attract, mind you. That's not an insult, by the way. My mom is an extremely smart former lawyer, right? Married a dinky sports writer. Love you, Dad. But when she heard we were having Steve Rushin on, she paused and said, oh my goodness, he is one of the best writers I have ever had an opportunity to read, which is what you said too. So if he's able to write these incredible pieces, these incredible books, and span demographics from my mom to my dad, you know he's going to be funny.
Right. And today is May the 21st, so it's 5/21. So that's an important day in baseball history for a lot of reasons and has a connection to Steve Rushin. 5/21 is the number of home runs that Ted Williams hit, that Frank Thomas hit, and that Willie McCovey hit. 3 500 homer guys with the exact same number. And Willie McCovey's nickname is famously Stretch, which is the nickname for Steve Rushin, at least for me. I'm the only person in the world that calls him Stretch. He will explain later. Also, and I know this by heart, 521 is the number of hits that my dear friend David Ross got in his major league career. And he's always making fun of himself, which he never should. But the beauty of David Ross is the last hit he got in the major leagues was a home run in Game 7 of the World Series. And no one had ever hit a home run in Game 7 of the World Series and then retired. Mm-hmm. And his first home run of his career was hit off of a position player, Mark Grace. So Mark Grace is pitching in a blowout. He looks up into the press box to our friend Rick Sutcliffe because he doesn't know who David Ross is and says, what should I throw him? And Sutcliffe says, throw him a curveball. And Grace yells back, I don't have a curveball. So he threw him a fastball, and David Ross hit a home run. So his first career homer was off a position player, and his last home run was in Game 7 of the World Series in the last at-bat of his career.
That game we were both at together in Cleveland.
One of the greatest games ever played.
2016. And I want to just shout out one listener real fast who chimed in, greatgameorwhat.com. His name is Bill. Last week we talked about Jim Palmer never gave up a Grand Slam in his entire career. Hall of Fame pitcher. He would intentionally walk some players because he didn't want to give up a Grand Slam, wanted to face somebody else. But he did tell me, he wrote, Bill, on our website, he gave up one Grand Slam in the minor leagues.
Sorry to be a pedantic little twit again. Johnny Bench hit the Grand Slam off of Jim Palmer in the minor leagues.
What are the chances of the one he gave up in the minor leagues ended up being against a fellow Hall of Famer eventually, of course?
This is the beauty of baseball. And the other never given up a Grand Slam note also applies to Gary Peters and Joaquin Andujar, both of whom pitched over 2,000 innings in their career. Never gave up a Grand Slam, Jeff, but they hit a Grand Slam. Think about that for a second.
That's unbelievable. Let's get to the takeaways and what's going on in Major League Baseball right now.
All right, Yu Darvish won his 200th game Sunday night. That's 200, meaning 107 in the major leagues and 93 in the Nippon Professional League. So he's the third player ever to get 200 wins between Japanese and American baseball, and he did it while extending his scoreless inning streak to 25. That guy is on a roll. That's why the Padres are still in this. And yet, he hasn't been the best Japanese pitcher this year. Shota Imanaga of the Cubs just lowered his ERA to 0.84, which is the lowest ERA through a pitcher's first 9 starts in the history of baseball, passing even the incomparable Fernando Valenzuela. So it was a great week for Japanese pitchers. Of course, it was a great week for all pitchers, Jeff, because the pitching today is just ridiculous. Paul Skeens had his second start of his career, 6 innings, no hits, 11 strikeouts, 5th rookie pitcher ever to strike out 10 and not allow a hit in a game. That's how good that guy is.
And he actually occupies the top 8 fastest pitches thrown by any starting pitcher this year.
Right.
All of them are 8 pitches by him.
Right. And again, he's made 2 major league starts. Tarek Skubal of the Tigers has been great, 6-0, 1.80 ERA, and has a changeup that is so good. And we have to at least acknowledge one hitter, Luis Matos of the Giants, came from the minor leagues. I mean, he didn't make the team. He comes up from the minor leagues. He drives in 17 runs in his first 7 games. The only 2 players in the history of baseball that have 17 RBIs in their first 7 games of a season were Pat Burrell in 2005 and Chris Davis in 2013. But they started the season with the team. They brought Matos up, and he went completely through the roof.
That's unbelievable. When you think about the expectation of a player joining a team, that's like Juan Soto-esque at the beginning of this season with the Yankees, how great he was.
Right.
But this is totally different in the beginning of the season or middle of the season.
Right. And of course, our game changer is another pitcher because pitching is just overwhelming today. Chris Sale of the Braves is now 6-1 with a 2.54 ERA. His last 3 starts through Sunday, he had struck out 9 or more and allowed 1 earned run or less. He's the first pitcher in the history of the Braves franchise, which goes back well over 100 years, to do that, meaning Smoltz, Glavine, Maddox, Warren Spahn. No one else did that except for Chris Sale. And Chris Sale, you got to remember, Jeff, he has been so banged up. 39 starts total over the 4 seasons combined, but through determination, through perseverance, young people listen to what Chris Sale had to do to get back, and now he's back at age 35. He's throwing mid-90s again, a really good, feel-good story. He got traded to Atlanta and has resurrected his career.
Our Quirk-gens are the opportunity to talk about the ins and outs of baseball, the game that we love, and I can't even begin to tell you the amount of Quirk-gens that come in through our website, greatgameorwhat.com, if you want to go check that out. You can also watch us on YouTube if you want to watch a podcast as opposed to just listen. You can watch and listen. But I love that the first one on our list has to do with Alec Bohm of the Phillies, one of which was asked on our Great Game or What website. They said, is this possible with how often this guy gets hit by a pitch that there's a Quirk-gen here?
Of course there is. And for anyone who's following our Quirk-gens, please send them in. There's so much out there. I can't spot everything in the box score. If you see something, send it to us. We'll use it, I promise. So Alec Bohm got hit with a pitch with the bases loaded in consecutive games. And you called me and said, Dad, when's the last time that happened? Yeah. Well, I checked with the Elias Sports Bureau. Nate McLeod, 2008, is the last player to get hit by a pitch in consecutive games with the bases loaded. And Bohm got hit with a pitch with the base load three times in a month.
Yeah.
So the last guy to do that was McLeod, also 2008, and Jose Vidro in 2001. So if you look closely enough, you'll see all sorts of crazy stuff.
And as of right now, he's the RBI leader in Major League Baseball.
And an MVP candidate in the National League, although the Dodgers may have that covered at the moment.
All right.
So, Jeff, I covered the game over the weekend, the Mariners and the Orioles, did the game on Saturday on the radio. So Friday night, I go to the game, and I watch the Orioles. They go in 4 consecutive at-bats, triple, double. And I think to myself, that's unusual. I promise you that hasn't happened too many times. So next morning, I call the Elias Sports Bureau, and I say, has this ever happened? So they can only go back to 1961 in covering every precise movement in a game. This is the first time since 1961 that any team went like this in consecutive at-bats. Triple, double.
Now, I have a quick question, and I'm sure people wonder this too. You were calling that game on ESPN Radio, right? In that moment, when you see that happen, are you texting somebody to try to get this stat during the broadcast, or are you like, I'm going to have to wait for this one?
It was 9 o'clock. It was 8 o'clock at night. I thought I'd give Frank from the Elias a chance to get a good night's sleep, and then I would text him in the morning. And of course, he found it in a matter of minutes. It was just amazing. But that's the beauty of baseball, Jeff. Every night you go to a ballpark, you might see something that you've never seen before. And speaking of that, Mason Miller, who we've talked about plenty of times on this, he pitched on Sunday. He pitched an inning and didn't strike anybody out. He throws 104 miles an hour with elite command. He's the most overpowering pitcher in the major leagues right now. So I looked it up. He's now pitched in 25 major league games. Granted, some of them have been as a starter. That's the first game he's ever pitched in which he didn't strike out a major league hitter. I mean, like, how great is that? It just jumped off the page to me that Mason Miller won and all zeros across with no strikeouts. That's how dominant that guy has been. Elly De La Cruz, who is a walking Quirk-genous, Jeff. As you know, against the Dodgers last week, he went 4 for 4 and stole 4 bases in one game.
Wow.
And then the next 3 games, he went 0 for 12 and struck out 8 times. The beauty of baseball, the degree of difficulty, including a 4 strikeout game. And I love this guy, so don't get this wrong. He also made his 10th error of the season. So I checked. No one had ever gotten to 10 errors and 30 stolen bases in a season this early, like Elly De La Cruz. Again, everything he touches is a great note because everything he does is absolutely spectacular, sometimes not always great.
That's not the double-double you want, 30 and 10.
Right.
Not a good double-double.
Right. And the last thing, Jeff, and the names in baseball, as you know, I'm just fascinated. So James McCan is the backup catcher for the Orioles, and one of my new favorite players, really smart, really insightful, helps me on a lot of levels. So there have been 5 guys named McCan who have played in the major leagues, and the last 3 have been catchers, and none of the 3 is related.
Really?
So we have Brian McCan, great player with the Braves, Astros, and others. James McCan, and now Kyle McCann is up for the Oakland A's. So I told James McCann this, and he just looks at me like, what an idiot you are that you would actually look this up, even though we laughed. But he said if Kyle McCann has a 10-year career, he said there's going to be a 3-decade stretch where there's a catcher in the major leagues named McCann.
These are the little things, right?
I love it. It's the little things that make everything great.
Well, we have Steve Rushin on, as we mentioned, and one of his all-time favorite players. I wish we could have planned this and made this on purpose.
Right.
But it just happened to fall this way,
right,
that it's a happy birthday to one of his favorite players, if not his favorite player
right,
of all time.
But first, we're going to get to Bobby Cox's birthday. Bobby Cox is 83 years old today. Bobby Cox won 2,504 games, and Bobby Cox's team, the Braves, lost to Ken Herbeck's team in the 1991 World Series, the greatest World Series I've ever seen, and Steve Rushin and I covered that, and he's going to talk about it very, very well on this podcast. But it's also Ken Herbeck's birthday. He's 64 years old today. He makes me laugh. You know, he's the guy who we talked about in episode 1, that when he retired, he took his protective cup and nailed it up against his garage, inside his garage, and 40 years later it's still there. So this is why Ken Herbeck is so great. So there used to be an infielder named Craig Graybeck who was 5'7" and 140 pounds, which is roughly what I weigh and roughly how tall you are.
Yeah.
Little guy, could really, really hit. And he wore number 14, which is the same number that Kent Herbeck wore. So I go to the Minneapolis Metrodome to do this story on this really little guy who can really hit, number 14, Craig Graybeck. So I'm walking up to talk to Craig Graybeck, and Kent Herbeck interrupts, and he looks at Craig Graybeck, who's half his size, and he goes, "Hey, you should put a slash between the 1 and the 4, and then you would be 1/4. So I go there to do a story about how little this guy, as Ken Herbeck writes the lead for me by saying this guy should be 1/4 instead of 14. Love him for that.
It's in the cards here on Is This a Great Game or What? Let's rip them for It's in the Cards. And we start off with Aaron Judge of the New York Yankees.
All right, he is red hot ever since he got ejected from his first game in his entire career. So the other day, he had 4 extra base hits. The second time he's had 4 extra base hits in one game, and the only other Yankees that have had multiple 4 extra base hit games are Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and Joe DiMaggio. Pretty good company.
Great company. And then Colton Cowser of the Baltimore Orioles, staying in the AL East.
Young guy, really good young player. And every time he comes to the plate, the people yell moo because his nickname is Cow. So I asked him the other day, I said, has anyone ever mooed you before this year? Because it sounds like booze, but it's moos. And he said, no, it happened in the big leagues, and he got off to a pretty good start. And Jeff, people come to games in Baltimore dressed as milkmen. And I was walking around town the other day briefly, and I saw a guy dressed up like a milkman because he was going to the Orioles game as a tribute to Colton Cowser.
You know, he got a burger named after him at a local Baltimore
Really?
stop. Yeah.
So great.
I think that's when you know you've made it.
Yes.
That and a bobblehead. Oh, look who we got here. This is a son of a star.
Kevin Biggio,
Yep.
yes. So 2 father-sons have hit for the cycle in their careers, Daryl and Gary Ward, and Kevin and Craig Biggio. And I'm going to tell you this again. Willie Mays, Barry Bonds, Hank Aaron, Babe Ruth never hit for the cycle, but Kevin Biggio and his dad did. Love that.
What about the Mariners' George Kirby?
George Kirby is one of the great control pitchers in the game. He's one of the great young pitchers in the game. A couple years ago, the first 24 pitches of a game he threw were strikes. 24. And he is so intense that Scott Service, the manager of the Mariners, told me the other day, no one talks to him on the day that he pitches. And Scott looks at me and he goes, even I don't talk to him. I'm afraid to talk to him. He's so much in his zone. He's so intense. You don't talk to George Kirby on the day he pitches.
Does anybody talk to Clay Holmes on the day he pitches?
All right, so Clay Holmes has one of the great hard sinkers in the game, 96 miles an hour. And he now, through Sunday, 20 innings pitched this year, 0 earned runs. And through Sunday, the Yankees' last 6 games had allowed a total of 6 runs. And their ERA through Sunday was the lowest at this point of the season of any Yankee team since 1952. And that Yankee team won the World Series.
And last but not least, we've got Gray Kessinger.
All right, Greg Kessinger, I really had some nice chats with him last year. He's a young infielder for the Houston Astros. He's a shortstop, and his grandfather is Don Kessinger, who I grew up watching, one of the really good shortstops. And Don Kessinger was the last player manager in the major leagues. I mean, Jeff, can you imagine a player manager today? So Gray and I started talking about his grandfather, who called him all the time about after a game, showed him this, show him that. And Gray looked at me, he goes, it's impossible to play in today's game. It's impossible to manage today. My grandfather did both.
That's kind of incredible. You've got a lot to think about when you got to do that.
Right. It's kind of like you on this show, Jeff. You're part of the talent and you're the producer.
Yeah, for those who watch on YouTube, maybe, you see me always, when I look over to my left, it's because I'm looking at the soundboard. I'm just making sure we're still rolling and recording because, trust me, we've had mistakes and had to record a whole episode, and boy, oh boy, I'm not easy on myself. Okay. League in Lids. Are you ready for another edition? We put all the Major League Baseball teams in our fancy new Lids lid. And this week, we've got the Seattle Mariners.
All right, the Mariners are the only current team that has never played in the World Series. And I just saw them 2 games over the weekend in Baltimore. Their starting pitching especially is tremendous. They have enough starting pitching to get to and win the World Series this year, but they're going to have to go find some offense somewhere because they simply don't score enough runs. So when I saw the Mariners the other day, I ran into Mike Blowers, who's one of their former Mariners, who's their color commentator on TV. So we get to talking, and he said that he just spoke to Jay Buhner the other day. Jay Buhner is not the greatest Mariner ever. Of course, Ken Griffey Jr. is. Jay Buhner is one of the great characters of all time. So 30 years ago at the Kingdome in Seattle, back when they used to do these things, they had Jay Buhner buzz cut night because he had just gotten a buzz cut. So 426 people sat in a barber's chair at the ballpark that night and got a buzz cut as a tribute to Jay Buhner. And Buhner told me, he said, Tim, there was hair flying everywhere. He said, I should have collected some of it in case I needed a weave someday. Jeff, those were the days when we had cow milking contests and bubblegum blowing contests and haircuts at the ballpark. We don't do much of that anymore, and it makes me sad.
You know what's coming up this week?
What is that?
It's National Brothers Day. Well, it's technically National Brothers Week, but it's on May the 24th. And I think one thing that makes baseball amazing, and sports across the board, but is the amount of brothers that have played Major League Baseball together.
Right. And again, I'm very close with my two brothers, Matt and Andy. Late Matt and Andy both are in the Hall of Fame at Catholic University. So brothers really matter to me. We have a new team on every show. You know, we had the all fruits and vegetables team. It's really ridiculous. But you inspired me to come up with the all brothers team. Right. So I found at every position on the field a Hall of Famer who had a brother who also played in the Major League. So Rick Farrell is our catcher, and he's a Hall of Famer because he was a great defensive catcher. But the joke always was, and I'm not sure it was a joke, his brother, Wes Farrell, was a pitcher, and Wes was a better hitter than his Hall of Fame catcher. Wes Farrell is one of the great hitting pitchers, if not the greatest hitting pitcher of all time. Okay, at first base, we had Eddie Murray. Again, these are all Hall of Famers.
So you're telling me these are all Hall of Fame baseball players that happen to have a brother
who played in the
major
leagues. Right.
Wow.
Right. So his brother, Rich, played in the major leagues. Of course, our second baseman is Roberto Alomar, whose brother, Sandy Alomar, caught for years, really good with the Indians and others. Our third baseman is George Brett. Ken Brett pitched in the major leagues, and George told me 100 times, my brother Ken was the best hitter in our family. He just decided to go and become a pitcher. Ken Brett hit a home run, Jeff, in 4 consecutive starts as a pitcher. No pitcher has ever done that. Think about that for a second.
That's insane.
Right. The shortstop, of course, is Cal Ripken Jr., whose brother Billy played second and played it exceptionally well. In the outfield, we had Hank Aaron, whose brother Tommy had a brief major league career.
It counts.
Center fielder, of course, is Joe DiMaggio, who had 2 brothers, Vince and Dom, who played in the major leagues. And our last outfielder are Lloyd and Paul Wainer, who are both Hall of Famers. It's the only pair of brothers who are both Hall of Famers. And then, of course, we have an entire pitching staff, basically, entire rotation. Gaylord Perry, whose brother Jim, who also won a Cy Young. Phil Niekro and his brother Joe, who won over 200 games. Dizzy Dean, his brother Paul, who pitched in the same rotation for the Cardinals.
I'll never get over that pairing. Dizzy and Paul. You're Paul.
Right. I'm Dizzy, you're Paul. And of course, Pedro Martinez with Ramon Martinez. So the Alou brothers, Jeff, are not Hall of Famers, although they were all really good players. But you have to have a shout out to the Alou brothers because they played in the same game and were in the lineup. They didn't start 1, 2, 3 in the order, but they all, during one game with the Giants in the early 60s, were in the lineup at the same time in one game. I mean, that's just amazing. 3 brothers playing in the major leagues in the same game on the same team.
Steve Rushin is going to be joining us next. Anything we should prepare our listeners for?
Again, Steve Rushin is the best writer I've ever seen. And please take this the right way, Jeff. I was sitting with him at a Braves game one night, and this woman, another sports writer, comes over and comes in between Steve and I. And she looks at Steve Rushin and says, "You are the greatest writer I have ever seen." And she knows who I am. She looks at me and she goes, oh, you're good too. But and then she went right back to complimenting Steve Rushin because that's what you have to do. So Steve, wherever Steve goes, great things happen and great things follow because that's just who he is. He's like Forrest Gump, only he's brilliant. So in 2001, on Halloween night, this is the year when everything got pushed back because of 9/11. Steve Rush and I go play basketball at the Reebok Club in the Upper West Side where he belongs. So Steve's a really good basketball player. So we're just shooting around and we're just about ready to leave. And these 2 guys walk in and say, "You guys want to play 2-on-2?" And one of the guys was Adam Sandler. So we played 2-on-2 with Billy Madison, and we just crushed their bones because the guy who was with him was the worst basketball player I have ever seen. And Adam Sandler didn't even know. So we won like 6 straight games. And Adam Sandler was pissed that he kept losing it.
Well, he's a good player,
He's
too.
a pretty good player. So I called home. I called you and Kelly, who were like 7 and 5 at the time. And I said, "You're not going to believe what I did today." And I said, "I played basketball with Happy Gilmore." And you guys thought that was the greatest thing ever because it was. It was so much fun. And we introduced ourselves and we talked baseball a little bit. It was fabulous. But really, the only Steve Rushin story you need to know was in 1992. He and I are covering the National League Championship Series. The winner of this game goes to the World Series. It's the Pirates and the Braves in Atlanta, Game 7, one of the most famous games ever. The Braves are down by 1 run with 2 outs in the 9th inning, and Francisco Cabrera comes to the plate. Now, he's the 25th man on the team. He's not even supposed to get into this game, but because of all the lineup changes, he is now coming up with 2 outs, 2 on, with a chance to win the game.
On a side note, this is why you and I love baseball. It's what we always say. You can't just give the bat to Mike Trout or Bryce Harper. You can't you give the ball to LeBron or Steph, right?
Right. And
it could be anybody.
And the last player on an NBA roster is not in the game for the final shot. And if he is in the game, there's no way he's taking it because Michael, LeBron, Larry, Steph Curry, they're going to take the final shot. But today it was up to Francisco Cabrera. So if he makes an out, the Braves lose. If he gets a hit and drives in both runs, the Braves win. And of course, he hits a hard ground single into left field, drives in both runs, one of the most famous games ever. And I am standing next to Steve Rushin, and the Atlanta Fulton County Stadium is exploding around us. And 30 seconds after that big hit, he looks at me and goes, "Abra Cabrera." And I thought, oh my gosh, I could have thought of that for 30 years and not come up with it. He came up with it in 30 seconds. That is our guest, Steve Rushin, coming right up. Is this a great game or what? And we're welcoming in my dear friend, Steve Rushin, one of the great writers of all time, my favorite author ever. Sorry to embarrass you, Stretch. I've read every one of your books more than once. Knights in White Castle, My Caddy Was a Reindeer. It's great. Stretch, good to have you on the show.
Oh, it's so great to be here. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Jeff. Love being here.
Our pleasure. All right, Stretch, I know you're not a baseball dope like I am, but I know as a kid that you loved baseball. Where did that come from in your house, your love of the game?
Well, it's funny because I grew up in Bloomington, Minnesota in the 70s, where Metropolitan Stadium was, where the Twins played. The Twins were terrible during the 1970s. They didn't draw. They didn't have any reason to draw. And I fell in love with baseball there and then. I think the big event in the 70s, as a Twins fan as a kid, was Eddie Bain had a few good starts for the Twins in maybe 1975. And that was like what, Mark Fidrich mania became a couple of years later, or the next year for us. And then 1977, Rod Carew, was flirting with 400 all summer and ended up at 388. And I was there on Rod Carew Souvenir Shirt Day when the commissary ran out of soda. That's what a cataclysmic event it was. And then I later worked in that commissary, 79, 80, and 81, the last 3 years that the Twins played at Met Stadium. I worked in the commissary, and it was like a Willy Wonka factory for baseball. You'd walk in, and there'd be batting practice balls just lying there like fallen apples on the orchard floor. You could just pick them up. Broken bats, pallets of Schmidt beer, and garbage bags full of popcorn. And we made the food that the vendor sold, but it was also a Lord of the Flies like place where they lock you in the walk-in freezer to punish you. Our managers, who are our older brothers. But in that walk-in freezer were Frosty Malts and Schweigert hot dogs. And to me, this is punishment, I knew then it was the greatest job I'd ever have. And I've had some great jobs, but it remains the greatest job I ever had. So I fell in love with baseball, working at Met Stadium and attending Met Stadium.
And Stretch, who was your favorite player back then?
Well, I had, from a very early age, it was George Mitterwald. I was born in Chicago, and this guy played for the Cubs and the Twins. It later became a series of non-Twin stars. Bombo Rivera. I loved Dave Engel. And I had a thing for Twins catchers, I guess. But my favorite player as a kid, and I'm fudging a little bit because all of my relatives lived in Cincinnati. So we would go to Cincinnati every other summer in the 70s. And so I would see the Big Red Machine. And I had a Joe Morgan poster on my bedroom door. And he was far and away my favorite player as a kid. Loved Rod Carew, but I loved Joe Morgan and the elbow flap. And we would imitate both Rod Carew and Joe Morgan in the backyard.
Steve, I've noticed that my dad has called you Stretch multiple times in this interview. And before we were talking, you and I actually have never actually met, at least that I can remember, but I've heard legendary stories about you, and I'm sure you've heard stories about me as well. But where does Stretch come from? What's that nickname?
Well, I'll tell you. Two people call me Stretch. I remember I did a long profile of Sparky Anderson for Sports Illustrated, and his name is George, and he said, I always know when I'm at the ballpark, if somebody yells George, if somebody yells Sparky, I don't turn around. But if somebody yells George, I turn around because I know it's an old friend of mine from childhood. So two people have called me Stretch in my life, and the first was Peter Carey, an editor at Sports Illustrated, who I'm certain, when I was a fact checker there, had no idea what my name was. So when I would have to go be summoned to his office to go over a story that somebody else had written and I was fact checking, he would turn to me and he would greet me with Stretch, because I'm 6'5", and it was the most obvious thing to call me. And so when I told this story to your dad, that he howled, and he said, and he instantly, and from that day forward, started calling me Stretch. So, which I love. So I know now. I haven't talked to Peter Carey in years, so I know now if somebody calls me Stretch, it has to be Tim.
Right. All right, Stretch, going back to your childhood, I know you loved baseball cards. You were fascinated by them, but you were mostly fascinated by what was on the back of the cards. Agreed?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I love the little line drawings. So the 1974 Topps was when I started collecting, and to this day, and I've got the full set that I collected in my basement still, the 75 Topps, those mid-70s Topps. And I love the little line drawings on the back where, they would depict baseball players in full uniform doing their off-season job. Lou owns a flower shop in St. Louis, and there's Lou in full uniform, with a bouquet of flowers. And as a kid, I thought, how cool is this? This guy's a Major League Baseball player, and he gets to wear his Cardinals uniform in the off-season when he's selling flowers. I remember that vividly. One of the twins, I think it may have been George Mitterwald, but it was his hobby is he likes to take home movies, and it had a little home movie camera, and it had a kind of a sinister, whatever, as an adult, but as a kid, it's like, we take home movies too, but he's in his full uniform. But the front of some of those cards were pretty amazing as well. And do you remember the Kurt Bavacqua Topps when he won the bubblegum blowing contest?
Yes.
And there was the bazooka calipers measuring the size of the bubble, the circumference of the bubble. I mean, that stuff, as the rest of my brain turns to oatmeal, that stuff remains. I think it'd be the last thought that I have before I expire is the 1974 horizontal Steve Garvey card that my dad came home from a business trip, and he was gone for a long time, and I'm sure he bought it at the airport or at the gas station on the way home. But it was the Topps 3-pack that you could see through the first card on each of the 3 windows, and Steve Garvey's horizontal card was one of those, and that doubled the size of my collection because there were probably 30 cards in that pack. And it remains a vivid memory of my childhood when so many other memories have disappeared.
Stretch, but when you grew up watching Kent Hrbek play, and then you're writing about Kent Hrbek. What was that like to cover a local hero like that?
It was insane. And so my older brother, I graduated from the Bloomington Kennedy High School that Hrbek attended and played at, and my brother, oldest brother, played baseball at Lincoln High School. Lincoln closed after my sophomore year, so I had to go to Kennedy. But my brother was a left-handed pitcher, and he always said that he owned Hrbek in high school. So, when the Twins were great and, winning the World Series, and then I was covering the Twins, I said to Hrbek in the first of all, I introduced myself to him one time. He said, "Oh yeah, you're the guy from Kennedy, aren't you?" Yes. And I loved Hrbek, and he said to me, I've been getting Sports Illustrated for 7 years, but I've never gotten one of those free videos that they offer in the commercial. How do I do that? Do I have to cancel my subscription and restart it? And I said, I I can get you one of those videos. What are you looking for? Like baseball's greatest hits? No, he wasn't a baseball fan. He made that clear. NFL's hardest hits. That's what he wanted. So I think he was making $3 million a year at the time. But so I said to him, I got to ask you, my brother always says he owned you. as a pitcher at Lincoln. And Herbeck thought about it for a second. And of course, he's heard this from so many people in the Twin Cities over the years. He thought about it for a second. He said, left-hander? And I said, yeah. He said, like, did he have like a red afro? And I said, he did. And Herbeck went, like that, just like whatever. And so I told my brother that, and he took that and has taken that ever since as confirmation. Why do you think he remembered me? If not because I owned him. So,
it wasn't because of the distinct red afro he had.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and exactly like a clown do.
Right.
But I sat in Rod Carew's home in the house that he was staying in when he was in need of a heart transplant, and we were in tears, and I found myself imitating Rod Carew's batting stance to Rod Carew like an idiot, like a complete moron. And I told him how my friends and I growing up, we would put Buddig brand pressed lunch meat, really thin pastrami into our cheek to imitate the chaw of tobacco, and he of course had had a long anti-tobacco crusade, appropriately so. But I just found myself babbling to one of my childhood heroes. But then I had so many of those moments, and Tim, you had a million more than I have, but where I'm standing on the front porch of Mark Fidrich's house doing a Where Are They Now story. And we're just sitting there having beers, and he's urinating off of one end of the porch and I'm off the other. And I'm like, I cannot believe this has happened to me. What's going on? So, there's just so many of those, and I'm super fortunate to have lived through them. I
just wish that story had led with, I found myself peeing off one end of the porch. Now,
well, yeah, I mean, I don't know I know what the etiquette is like in a bank of urinals at the airport. You try to space yourself
right
out, but at Mark Fidrich's farm, you use separate ends of the front porch.
Right.
So.
And just staying with the Twins for one more minute, Jeff, we covered the World Series together several years, but in 91, he and I are sitting in the auxiliary press box at the Metrodome, and this is the greatest World Series I've ever covered. Stretch, tell us what it was like that day, how loud that crowd was as we're watching one of the greatest Game 7s in Major League history, and then, of course, he wrote the greatest game story I've ever seen.
Well, the game was the series itself was unbelievable, and Game 6 ended with Kirby Puckett's home run, and we'll see you tomorrow night, and all that. And it was just, and the place was vibrating. And Jack Morris, of course, said that night, in the words of the late great Marvin Gaye, "Let's get it on." So it was like 24 hours of just, just tension building, and then this great 10-inning 1-0 game, and the Puckett home run, it was as loud as anything. Louder than anything I've ever heard. And I have a permanent ringing in my ears from a car accident in 2018. The EMT said, it was on a Friday, they said, this might last until Monday. It has lasted for 6 years now. But it's very similar to what I experienced for a week after that World Series, the ringing in my ears. And I had a rental car, but I was staying in the house that I grew up in Bloomington. And I remember leaving the Metrodome, I don't know, 1 in the morning or 2 in the morning to go to the house that I grew up in to write. And I remember seeing a drunk on top of a city bus, an MTC city bus, like surfing on top of a moving bus. And I thought, that's not good. But that was the sort of atmosphere in which all this took place. And then I went home to the basement of the house that I grew up in, where growing up, I would watch Twins games on TV in that basement, and I would write game stories on my mom's Royal typewriter. Well, now I've got a laptop, but I'm that probably weighed 16 pounds, but I wrote that game story in the same basement where I wrote 5 years earlier. I was writing stories about Twins games I had watched on TV. So it was a surreal, if you set the bar low enough, you can make your dreams come true kind of moment for me. And still one of the most memorable nights of my life.
Steve, we all have something in common here, that we played Strat-O-Matic. And yeah. I actually created a league with my uncle, his son, my cousin, and the two of us, we created a little league, but I got really excited, so I made a card for Cal Ripken Jr. because at that time he wasn't in the Hall of Fame and we were playing with the Hall of Fame cards, right? So only Hall of Famers have cards, right? It was a year before he got inducted. And I also made a card for our grandfather. And these cards were not statistically accurate whatsoever. I mean, I think it made it look like Cal Ripken Jr. would have hit 1,200 home runs in his career. So there was no accuracy to it. But adding them to the deck of the actual players was ridiculous of me to do at age 10. However, you are a Strat-O-Matic player, and you also played with fictional players. Is this true?
Well, no, a buddy of mine who's done a bunch of work at our house, building cabinets and building a deck and all that. He played in, may still play in a Strat-O-Matic league that had fictional players and the names. I mean, I wish I could remember the names. The names were just the best. But what you say about, Cal Ripken would have hit 1,200 home runs. When I played as a kid, I played the entire 1980 Royals season. And I don't know why I chose the 1980 Royals, but I got George Brett to hit 400 that year. He hit like 421, and those Royals won like 124 games. So I do think that when you're playing as a kid and you think you're playing completely above board, I must have had my thumb on the scale massively to achieve either that or I would have made the greatest baseball manager of all time, and I don't think that's the case.
So, Stretch, I just looked this up because I wrote this. Kutubi Leister was the best player. Do you remember that?
I remember that name, yes. That my friend Steve Hartman is going to love this because he's a baseball nut, he's a Phillies nut, and the fact that Kutubi Leister came out of Tim Kurkjian's mouth, this is going to blow his mind because now it's kind of made him real.
Right, and there are a couple others. Ben Dover was one of the players. And my favorite, Steve, Three Penny Franklin in 1975.
Oh, I love it.
You know, it's worth noting for your buddy, too, that when Dad said he's looking it up, he pulls his own book off of the shelf here to look up and finds the exact page where these players are written in Is This a Great Game or What? His second book.
I felt like I was in a court of law, and he was pulling out a transcript. But you know what's beautiful about that? Tim, that book, so Kutubi Leister, Ben Dover, and Three Penny Franklin are in that book.
Right.
And I don't know if Jeff knows this, but years ago, I was at a White House Christmas party for reasons that don't bear going into now. George W. Bush wrote me a letter while he was president. I ended up going down to a White House event. I walked into a receiving line at the White House, and the President of the United States, the sitting president of the United States at the time, greeted me with, Mr. Sports Illustrated, I was just reading about you in Kurkjian's book. Page 38 or whatever.
No way.
He had nice things to say about you. You know, your phones are seized or don't work at the White House. As soon as we got out of the White House and my phone was working again, I called you, Tim, and told you that, and we howled. I mean, he was reading your book while he was president.
Right.
So,
one of my favorite.
So he read about Kutubi Leister.
He knows him too. Three Penny Franklin,
the leader of the free world.
Exactly.
Knows about a fictional Strat-O-Matic player.
Ben Franklin and Three Penny Franklin, the big figures of the White House.
Right.
So Jeff, I used to get such a big kick out of Steve Rushin because I told him that some of the baseball writers that preceded me at the Baltimore Sun had a rather odd way of presenting like certain things in the newspaper. Stretch, do you remember any of those that say Lou Hatter, my dear friend, would write? Tell us the ones that tickled you the most.
My favorite ones were, a visiting pitcher was towing the alien humpback.
What does that mean, as he would say?
But we know exactly what it means, and anybody thrown out at the plate had expired at the cash register. I mean, and I have to say, I think some of that stuff was still sort of in the sporting news when I was a little kid and would get the sporting news. And it was part of what I loved. I like the backs of the baseball cards. It was part of the weird secret handshake romance of baseball to me.
Right.
You know, I was at my son's high school the other day, and he was doing a basketball workout. And I got there early to do the carpool, and the high school baseball team was playing. So I watched a half an inning. And as I was leaving, I saw the mother of the pitcher just pulling into the lot. And I texted her and I said, Thomas just got himself out of a bases loaded jam. And as I'm typing that, I'm thinking, I don't even know if she knows what this means. You know, it's such sort of newspaper-ese of a different time, but I love it. You know, he you know, the Sacks were drunk with East Windsor Highlanders or whatever, but he worked his way out of the jam, and I can still slip into that and kind of love it.
Right, and Stretch, when a game went to extra innings, those were called
bonus panels. I mean, the beauty, what I miss. I mean, I love baseball. I watch games. I took my son to Fenway a few weeks ago, and I love everything about it. It's my favorite sport. I love all of it. But what I miss most about covering it on a regular basis is just sitting in the press box and talking nonsense, this kind of nonsense. And I remember being at a Yankees playoff game back during their 90s dynasty with Steve Cannell of Sports Illustrated, and we worked up this we worked up the outgoing voicemail for Yankee Stadium. It was Bob Shepard's voice, of course, and he was saying, press one, you've reached the New York Yankees. Press 1 for Mickey Mantle. Press 2 for Mickey Rivers. Press 3 for Mickey Klutz. For all other Mickeys, press star. And that stuff was my favorite. Meanwhile, we're missing all kinds of game action, in the World Series, but that's the kind of stuff that I loved about baseball the most.
Right. Now, Stretch, one of the things that did happen to you was in the Angels managerial clubhouse when you were doing a story on the Angels. Can you explain what hit you in the head that day?
Yeah, I was doing a story on Chuck Finley, and this didn't happen very often, but I was told, my marching orders were, we want to put him on the cover as the best left-hander in baseball. Can you get somebody to tell you that he's the best left-hander in baseball? So I went on a 115-degree day to Fenway, where the Angels were playing in Boston, and I was talking to Angels skipper Doug Rader before the game about Chuck Finley. And I said, would you say you think he's the best left-hander in baseball? What? I wouldn't say he's the best left-hander on our staff. We've got Mark Langston, we've got Jim Abbott, and okay. But I kept at it. Anyway, you can look up the box score, and I'm pretty confident that I'm right. Chuck Finley lasted 1/3 of an inning that day. He gave up something like 7 or 8 runs, and they still had to play 3 more hours of baseball in 110-degree heat and lose. And so after the game, I go into Doug Rader's office, and he sees me, and understandably, it triggered some kind of internal rage. Here's the guy who was telling me how great Chuck Finley is 3 hours ago. And he took off his pants and he threw them across the office and struck me in the head. Doug Rader threw his pants at me, is what I'm trying to say. And, the static cling, they kind of those double knit polyester, they kind of took a while to fall off. And he later apologized and said he was trying to throw them in the hamper. And I completely understood why he was not thrilled with me. But I told that story to a Chuck Nevius of the San Francisco Chronicle once, and he covered Rader with the A's. And he said once Rader was going on a rant in the Oakland clubhouse, and Chuck was following him around taking notes, and Rader threw his pants in the air while removing them during the rant, and they landed on Chuck's head. And Chuck's, like when somebody spits a fleck of lettuce onto your shirt or something during lunch and you have to pretend that it's not there. Chuck continued to just take notes and nod with his pants on his head, because he said, if I removed the pants, he worried that it would send him, into a further rage. So I just love that somebody, when I had Doug Rader's pants thrown at me, another professional colleague could say, oh yes, the same thing happened to me. But covering baseball.
Right. Well, one of my favorite Chuck Finley stories was about 15 years ago, at least. He was with the Indians, and they'd been through like 36 pitchers that year, which isn't much these days, but back then it was a lot. So he put together a contest who could name as many of the 36 pitchers that played on the. So they were all teammates, and Chuck Finley won because he guessed 31 out of the 36. But he said we had a big debate whether one of the pitchers' names was Kane Davis or Davis Kane. They weren't sure what his name was, and he was on the team. It was Kane Davis. That's what Chuck Finley did.
I think Katubi Leister was on that staff that year. That is like a analog immaculate grid that before there was an internet, and Jeff won't understand this, but guys would lug around giant suitcases with the baseball encyclopedia and all the media guides. You're one of them, and Jeff, your dad told me during the 1991 National League Championship Series or the World Series, we were in Atlanta, flying back to, I think, Minneapolis during the World Series. And we saw a couple of people with wheeled luggage, rollerboard suitcases, not flight attendants, and which used to be flight attendants and pilots had them, but nobody else. We saw civilians. And your dad looked at me and said, "Stretch, if you ever see me pulling wheeled luggage through an airport, just kill me." And within a year, he had wheeled luggage. So I don't know. The one thing that I remember vividly about that World Series is not the games, but that's when wheeled luggage first became a big thing.
Steve, this is so evident. My dad, a year before we bought him a pair of AirPods, which he calls his iPods, by the way, that he puts in his ear, he said to me, "If you ever catch me talking on one of those headphones in a public place, just kill me." And then a year later, he said, "Hey, I'm at the grocery store and I'm talking to you without my phone." So it seems like it's par for the course.
Right.
He's on his ninth life for sure.
Right.
He's, wheeled luggage and AirPods.
Right. Oh, so I think one thing that, my dad has praised your writing ability and says you're the best writer he's ever been able to read. And he's made sure that we didn't emphasize that too much because you're so humble and you won't accept that. But I heard that you wrote an article about a hot dog.
I think I've written multiple articles on hot dogs, but I did write a long what were called bonus pieces at Sports Illustrated on the hot dog. It is the staple food of the ballpark.
No doubt.
I always maintained as somebody covering baseball that what you ate at the ballparks physically exempted you from any ill health consequences just because you were eating it in front of a baseball game. I think it was Humphrey Bogart who said a hot dog at Dodger Stadium beats prime rib at the Ritz, and that's the way I feel about it. And I remember interviewing what's his name, the Nathan's annual hot dog eating champion,
Joey Chestnut.
Right. And Joey Chestnut said this is a separate article, mind you. This was an article about the hot dog eating contest, and Joey Chestnut, a big, at least he was big Oakland A's fan and a regular attendee at A's games, and he told me that I said, are you recognized? Are you mobbed at A's games? And he said, "No, I just sit there watching the game until I get a hot dog. And then, if I get a hot dog from a vendor and then the light bulb goes on, and it's when they see the hot dog in his hand that they recognize him as Joey Chestnut." So, and I said, "Isn't that a busman's holiday, eating hot dogs at a baseball game? Isn't this, don't you feel like you're back at work?" And he said, "No, he loves hot dogs. He gets the $1.49 or whatever it is at Sam's Club or Costco."
Yeah.
And so I think it's a universal impulse. I'm here in roughly equidistant between Yankee Stadium and Fenway Park, and I still feel obliged to get a Fenway Frank when I'm at the game, whether I want one or not, whether I'm hungry or not. And I think the only more evocative baseball food for me is the helmet sundae, obviously. Anything served in a sundae, anything served in a helmet is the best, and of course nacho cheese, the cheese with a Z, the molten school bus orange stuff that you get with nacho chips at the game. So that's what I love, and as Tim knows, I love. When he loves, you love, Jeff, everything about baseball, and so much of that has nothing to do with whatever is going on the field. Oftentimes that's just an ancillary thing.
Steve, I would love to see Joey Chestnut's Topps card from when you were growing up. Of Joey Chestnut loves to mow his lawn on Saturdays, and he's there, and he's eating a hot dog while he's mowing his lawn. Well, that's the only way they know him.
I would love to see, because that Kurt Bavacqua bubblegum thing. That was the bazooka bubblegum blowing contest, and so we have the Nathan's contest on the 4th of July. Bring back the bazooka or the double bubble or whoever wants to sponsor contest. Because that should be part of the All-Star experience along with home run derby.
It really should.
Right. And again, Jeff, this is what you missed growing up. When Stretch and I were covering and growing up, they would have cow milking contests on the baseball field. Yeah. Stan Belinda, reliever for the Pirates, right. He was like a real farmer, so he won. Although Rich Donnelly, our dear friend, said, well, he cheated. He was using skim milk. I'm not exactly sure what that meant. But yes, we would have cow milking contests on the field, bubble gum blowing contests. Gotta say, Stretch, we miss those days, correct?
Oh my gosh, completely. When I walked into Fenway a couple of weeks ago, I made sure that my son venerated the baseball cap, bullpen, buggy, golf cart, whatever you want to call it. And those were the things that, as much as Rod Carew or Joe Morgan captured my imagination as a kid, the bullpen car, fungo bats, the word fungo, no pepper. What is pepper, and why can't we have it? That stuff just completely bewitched me as a kid, and still does in many ways.
Yeah, and back to hot dogs for a minute. Of course, Stretch is married to Rebecca Lobo, and Rebecca had some beautiful tweet a few years ago, like, my husband just wrote a 5,000-word story about hot dogs, and she thought she got the biggest kick out. I'm married to this guy, and that's what he's writing about.
Well, let me just tell you, her experience of baseball is, so she grew up a Red Sox fan. She got Carlton Fisk's autograph on a baseball and told me, Carlton Fisk was such a nice guy, and then she met Roger Clemens, and he was such a nice guy, and said, let me tell you, I had very different experiences covering these guys. The very first story I did on the baseball beat for Sports Illustrated, they sent me out this week. I went to cover the Brewers. I interviewed, I think, everybody on the roster. And then they said, no, we don't want to do the Brewers this week. We want to do the White Sox. Go down to Chicago. It was the last year of old Comiskey. And I was standing on the field talking to our photographer, Ron Madra. And Carlton Fisk came over to Ron and said, hey, those pictures you took of me in spring training, could I get a copy? Blah, blah. So I didn't come up to his conversation. He came up to our conversation. And so I introduced myself. I'm Mr. Fisk. I'm Steve Rushin from Sports Illustrated. I'm 22 years old, and I'd love to interview you today. And he just turned and walked away without a word and just started. And I said, oh, did he not hear me? And so I followed him. And he's going into the dugout and down the clubhouse tunnel. And he said, I got meetings all day today. And I said, well, I'll be here for the next 3 days. And he said, I've got meetings for the next 3 days. So that's when I knew that I was going to be a very highly strung, stressed out guy for the next 3 years. And Ron Madra, by the way, our baseball photographer, he and I were leaving Riverfront Stadium once at the end of a 3 or 4 game series that I was writing about and he was photographing. And we were late I think we were on the same flight back to LaGuardia, and we were late. And he said, let's just grab a cab. And I said, well, what about your rental car? We had parked his rental car in a garage near Riverfront Stadium in downtown Cincinnati. He said, Hertz will find it. And so we, and I was like, that was something I didn't know you could do. You could just leave your rental car somewhere downtown.
Is this a bird scooter?
Yeah, believe me, the expense accounts then were, if he had to charge an entire rental car, so be it. And it would probably, and that may have been the same trip to Riverfront where they announced in the press box, we have a set of keys here. If anybody lost their keys, come claim them. And whoever I was sitting next to and I had a good laugh, and, kind of a schmuck loses his keys in the press box. I got back to New York, got to my apartment. I didn't have my keys. I couldn't get into the building. I went to the Time and Life building and slept on my boss's couch because I could get into the building, and her office had a couch. So I was the guy who left his keys at Riverfront Stadium.
And speaking of Riverfront Stadium, Cesar Geronimo used to play for the Reds. And Stretch wrote in one of his books, what does Cesar Geronimo yell when he jumps out of a plane? Sorry, Stretch. That has made me laugh more times than almost anything I can remember. All right, getting back to Rebecca for a minute. What is it like being married to a trailblazer in the history of women's basketball and someone who's still deeply involved in the calling of games and the analysis of games?
Well, it's funny. Rick Riley, our former colleague, was doing a book event somewhere, and he opened it up to questions after a 40-minute talk. And the one hand went up, and the guy said, "What's it like being married to Rebecca Lobo?" And people would often get us confused because we both had. Rick said, "It comes in handy when you need to get something off the top shelf at the grocery." But she and I are the same height. But it's wonderful. We were at an AAU basketball tournament this weekend with our 8th grader, and people still want her picture and still want to tell her, how much what she has done for women's basketball has meant to them, men and women, kids who see her on TV now. And Tim, I'm sure you get a lot of this, just from your work on ESPN. It's really, we joke about it a lot. And our 8th grader is like rolling her eyes and like, we're never going to get out of here. But it's wonderful. It was almost 30 years ago now that she won the national championship with UConn in 1995, and the mail and the comments in the public have never waned in that time. She came home from the Final Four in Cleveland and was at the grocery store doing self-checkout. And from the next self-checkout register, a woman said, "Hey, Rebecca, I heard you said you don't think Caitlin Clark is the GOAT." And Rebecca said, no, what I said was, I think all GOAT conversations are stupid. Nobody was shooting threes before there was a 3-point shot.
Right.
It would have been strange. And the lady said, "Yeah, well, you're never going to live that down." And so every time we go out, there is a you come back with an anecdote. And as a writer, that's what I like best.
Steve, how did you two meet and ultimately get together?
Yeah, we met the old-fashioned way. We met, I'm a sports writer. She's an athlete, but we met in a dive Irish bar in New York, the Dublin House on West 79th Street. She was playing for the New York Liberty. And they always lived across the street from Madison Square Garden. And in her 3rd season, she didn't want to do that. She wanted to sublet an apartment. So she was subletting an apartment, had gotten the keys to that apartment. And the person she was subletting from, who I happen to know, though that was a total coincidence, took her to the neighborhood bar after turning over the keys. I was out with a friend of mine. He was meeting our mutual friend at this bar later and suggested I come along. So I did. And that's where I met Rebecca. I introduced myself. She recognized my name from Sports Illustrated, asked if I had recently written some disparaging potshot one-liner about women's basketball or the WNBA, and I blushed and said I had. She asked me how many games I had attended, and I said 0. And she invited me to a game. I went, and 23 months later, we were married. So
wow.
Yeah, I benefited from, as you can see now, I benefited from the very poor lighting at the Dublin House, dark Irish bar. She did not get a good look at me. Thank God.
Stretch, we could keep you all day here. Let's just finish with when you look back at your years that you covered baseball, where you were a primary baseball guy. Now you do everything. You did everything back then. What is your biggest takeaway from baseball and the time that you covered?
The time that when I was doing it, and I can say this honestly, when I was doing it, some percentage of me was just mind blown that I'm allowed to do this and that I'm getting to do this. And another percentage, maybe slightly larger percentage of me was in constant stress. I would walk into a baseball clubhouse and I would feel like I was getting an ulcer, and not just because of the circumstances. I walked into the visitors clubhouse at Wrigley Field and I can't believe I'm here. And then Jerry Royce grabs my press tag and says, "Working press? That's like jumbo shrimp." And today I would completely embrace that, but then I just felt like this is the reason they call it a clubhouse. I'm not a member of the club. But looking back now, almost all of that has washed away. And looking back, it is, here I am. I'm sitting in the dugout at Wrigley Field, or I'm talking to, I'm with Jim Leland in his house in Pittsburgh in December, and for so long that at some point, 6 hours into it, and his pregnant wife comes home to talk about her checkup with the doctor, and he says to me, "Steve, you going to go at any point? You going to actually leave at some point?" And so those memories, Mark Fidrich or covering the World Series, those things are just it feels in some ways like I dreamt it, and in some ways I still think I did.
Steve Rushin, or so admirably put, Stretch, thank you so much for joining this show. My dad, I have not seen him laugh that hard.
Oh, God, you guys. Jeff, you're now in the circle of Stretch. You guys now call me that. So
it's an honor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, guys. Right. Love this.
Thank you, Stretch. We had a great time. See you soon, okay?
Please, let's hope so.
All right.
Thank you so much, Steve Rushin, for joining us. That was, I've never seen you laugh that hard. Some of those stories were amazing, and he told that great story about Mark Fidrich. Do you have a little more on this guy? Because I don't know him.
So Mark Fidrich in 1976 became a cultural phenomenon in baseball. He won 19 games that year for the Tigers, completed 24 games, finished second in the Cy Young voting. But it wasn't just that. He was the most colorful guy in the game at the time, and one of the most colorful of all time. His nickname was the Bird because he had flowing hair and he looked like Big Bird from Sesame Street. But he used to play with the dirt on the mound. He used to talk to the ball. He was arguably the most entertaining pitcher that I've ever seen. I'll never forget when Monday Night Baseball came out in the mid-'70s. Like, what a glorious thing. We don't have to just watch. We get more than a Saturday game. Now we get a Monday night game, and Mark the Bird Fidrich is pitching on national TV on a Monday night, and he threw an absolute gem, and we were all, the entire country was mesmerized by this guy. He's gone now. Terrible life after baseball in a lot of ways, health-wise, but he's a pitcher that I will never forget.
Thank you so much for listening. We're looking forward to next week because we'll have a Memorial Day episode, including the granddaughter of a truly amazing, one of the most legendary baseball Hall of Famers of all time will be joining us. We're going to talk to her, and it's going to be a powerful day to remember those we've lost.
Right. Next week, Lindsay Barrow will make you laugh, and she will make you cry.
Thank you for listening, and always thank you for being a part of our family.